This video is both a review of the Sulun SPAS-12 and a comparison of it to the original Franchi SPAS-12. The short summary of my review of the Sulun gun is that it likes heavy loads, and if you want it to run reliably, it's best to leave the magazine capped at 5 rounds, and also not to try to shoot it one-handed with the hook. To go into more detail, I've only had the opportunity to put somewhere between 120 and 150 rounds through the gun, which is admittedly not a lot, but the issues I had were fairly consistent, so I think I've got a good idea of how it is. I encountered two problems. The first is that a couple times the rounds were not coming out of the tube properly. It seemed that the follower might have been getting hung up on the transition from the magazine extension to the main tube body. I also noticed that the magazine spring is fairly weak for an 8-round tube. I replaced it with a stronger spring and the problem didn't occur again. If you leave the magazine capped at 5 rounds, none of that should be an issue. The other problem, which I think is somewhat more concerning, is after a while, when shooting the gun one-handed, the forend would come out of the automatic position. This would cause the gun to fail to fire for some reason. I would have more likely expected it to not cycle the next round, but it is what it is. Either way, that's not a problem if you're shooting it normally from the shoulder with your offhand on the forend. Now, the weakest ammo I tried was some Suprema buckshot. That's, I believe, 1 ounce at somewhere between 1300 and 1350 feet per second. That ran fine most of the time shooting the gun from the shoulder, but gave the occasional stovepipe. I had some Winchester buckshot and Remington slugs, both of which ran without issue. For comparison, the Franchi over there runs perfectly with the Suprema, even shooting it one-handed. Now let's move on to a detailed comparison of the two guns. Let's go to the muzzle end and start with the thread protector. The Sulun version is a little longer, and the barrel lacks this step behind it. They didn't copy the thread pattern or use anything common. The Turkish manufacturers seem to be fans of using proprietary thread patterns. It's basically useless for anything other than holding the thread protector on. Next, you can see that the front sights are a different style. Sulun copied the older style of front sight. You can see here on this spare barrel, much more similar. The magazine tube extensions are very similar. This is slightly thicker. It's made of aluminum versus steel on the original. The sling swivel is wider than the original, which I suppose is good if you want to actually use it. Now, moving on to the handguard. Very similar. The hole patterns seem to match. The screws are slightly different though. The fore end also very closely matches the original. Same number of lines, but slightly different placement. The button is very similar. A weaker spring. Overall, easier to switch between modes too, which might be convenient, but I believe that is responsible for the issue which I mentioned earlier. Next, we move to the rear sight. At first, they look nearly identical, but if we look through the sight, we can see that this is a simple circle, whereas on the original, there is a notch at the bottom that's intended for use when shooting slugs. Next, we will move on to the receiver. On here, we have the carrier latch button on the right side, and no controls on the left side. On the original, we have a magazine cutoff on the right and the carrier latch on the left. It's also worth noting that on the original, you cannot load the gun without pressing the carrier latch button. On the clone, that isn't the case. The bottom of the receiver is also relieved to make loading easier. It's convenient, I'll give it that. The bolt handles are basically identical. The clone is a little larger, I'd guess. The top of the receiver comes with a Picatinny rail mounted. I took that off because not only is it ugly, but it also made it difficult to latch the folding stock closed. On the original, there's nothing on the top. Now, let's move on to the trigger groups. As you can see, on the original, the trigger guard is enlarged, and on the clone, it is not. The clone has a simple cross-bolt safety behind the trigger. It clicks on nicely, but doesn't have much of a click off. I'll give them that it's more convenient than what Franchi came up with, but it's not very good. Here we can see it is a cross-bolt safety also, but located in front of the trigger, fairly far in front. Not convenient, but clicks on and off nicely. If we look at the other side, we have this lever. This functions as both the action release and as a secondary safety. In this position, it is off as a safety, and the action is locked until you either put it on or pull the trigger. If you put it on, the trigger doesn't function, and the action can be released manually. And with it off, locked, unlocked. I should mention that it is locked both in pump action and semi-auto. On the clone, we see nothing there. So in pump action mode, this will slide open without pulling the trigger. Not great, if you ask me. Now let's look at the grip and stock. Overall quite similar, but there are many differences in the details. First, the grip on the clone is a simple one piece with a big hole in the bottom. On the original, it's a much more solid two-piece grip. It's built that way because these were meant to have a grip safety, which would have gone where this plug piece is here. But they gave up on that idea and just put the plug in. Now, the stocks work quite similar. We have this button to fold the stock here. Quite difficult to use on this one. Folds over like so. And the same here. This one is a bit easier. Now, in the closed position, this has this little notch here where it latches into, whereas this one simply is between this button and the top of the receiver. You can see the little bumper piece there. That's the bumper. On the clone, we have the hole for the bumper, but no bumper. That would be because they ship with the Picatinny rail on, and it wouldn't fit with that there. Although it would be nice if they included it. Now, towards the rear, butt plates are very similar. The button here works the same. Also a bit difficult to use on this one. This one. Now here we can see the buffer and the spring for the hook. This spring is pretty weak. Here we see the spring in this little hole here. It's a very stiff spring. Takes quite a bit of force to actuate. Now, here I'd like to point out another potential problem. What the buffer is there to do is prevent this metal back here from ramming against the pin. As you can see, it doesn't really do much compared to here, where you can see it's pushed towards this side of the hole, and it takes a bit of force to compress it. So on the clone, over time, you might have the potential for damage back here if you were to fire it a lot. The hooks are also a different shape. If we can line that up well. On the original, you can see it's a much flatter curve versus the simple bend on the clone. Also, I should mention that this originally had a little metal bumper filling the hole. That seems to have disappeared, probably while shooting the gun. Not really a big deal, but also not great. Moving to a different angle, I'd like to show you the differences in the geometry of the stocks. First, I'll mention that the distance from the trigger to the back of the grip is about a ½ inch longer on the clone than the original. The grip is a little slimmer, which helps, but I still find this more comfortable. I'm going to try to line these two up so that you can see the differences in the stock. Not the easiest thing to do on camera, but if we go it's about like that. The length of pull on the clone is about 14.5 versus 13 on the original. 13 is fairly standard for this style of shotgun. Now, I believe the cause for that is that this pivot here is further back and down compared to the original, where it's here. This, because it has to clear the rear sight when folded, it needs to be longer. You can see they've also cut this out further than on the original. We can also see that this is two pieces welded together versus the one-piece construction on the clone. Now the angle is different too. See, this here angles upwards, whereas this is more straight back. I believe that's for the hook. You can see the hook has a deeper curve. Since this is meant to go to the side and rest under your forearm for shooting one-handed, the stock has to go up further. I actually see some older pictures of these where this hole was up here near the reinforcement rib. Seems to have been a later change in the design. I'll also note that due to the stock being quite a bit longer, if you want to shoot it one-handed, you need to have decently long arms. If you're a shorter individual, that's probably not for you. I have field stripped the two guns so we can look at some of the internal differences. Mechanically, they are quite similar. The clone is not exactly the same, but it is definitely a Franchi-inspired design. First, let's look at the magazine tube springs. This is the spring from the original Franchi SPAS-12, and this is the clone. We'll line the rear end up and then go see the front. As you can see, Sulun used a relatively short spring. Not very good for a 8-shot tube in my opinion, but fine for 5 shots. Then the gas pistons. Similar, but the Franchi is much beefier and more complex. I should also note that the Franchi version uses this O-ring to seal the gas system and won't run reliably without it. The clone doesn't have any O-ring. Then the action bar. The Sulun version uses this one piece, which is actually quite similar to the Franchi 500, which the SPAS-12 is based off of. It uses this two-piece action bar design, though. The bolt on the clone has a locking lug towards the front, whereas on the original, it is towards the rear of the bolt. The Sulun gun has this anodized aluminum follower, whereas the original uses a steel follower. Here we can note that the clone has these captive pins. Supposedly convenient, but I found them relatively difficult to get into the position to remove the trigger group. As mentioned before, the trigger group on the clone is much simpler. Basically the same thing you'd find in any semi-auto shotgun. Whereas the original is a bit more complicated and has features you'd normally see only on a pump shotgun. Now this is where we're going to leave things. If you have any questions or you feel there's anything I've missed, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll do my best to answer. I hope this video has been informative.